Lecy. I'm going to be talking on this topic about the economic geography of nonprofits. This is more of a research arc than a research topic. It's a combination of a few different projects and how they're pieced together, and we're open to go with it with some new data that we've just acquired and done processing. So this is partly just a story about the interesting impact of the nonprofit sector, and then some ways that we can approach it with some new data. So I do a lot of work on the nonprofit sector, and one of the first things you always talk about with the nonprofit sector is how big it is, how many nonprofits there are. It's the third largest industry in the country by employment, large percentage of the economy. But the reason I think it's interesting and important is because of the impact that the nonprofit sector can have on communities. Impact can be hard to quantify, so I like to start with this story about the town of Rosetta. This was a community in Pennsylvania, primarily Italian immigrants, and it was discovered when there were some public health efforts to collect data on heart disease and causes of early death. As they were putting together this big public health study, there was this one small town that the average lifespan was about 10 years longer than all of the neighboring communities. So it was a huge outlier. It was a huge positive outlier to the extent that they thought it was a data entry error. So they went back, they were collecting all the records directly, and double-checked it. They went to eventually visit the community to make sure that the records were right. And it was true. In this community, everyone was healthy and had a lot longer life than the community around them. So this posed this mystery. Well, why was it that this community had such strong health? And so they went through this process. Originally, they thought it might be differences in diet, so they compared that to the neighboring communities. The diet was similar. They thought it might be ancestry, but it turned out that this part of Pennsylvania had a lot of communities of Italian immigrants that were all working in similar industries. They even thought they tied this particular clan back to the region of Italy that they came from, and they found other of that same clan that moved to other parts of Pennsylvania, and they all had lower lifespans. So the one explanation that was left over in this community is that they had this really strong just civic bond. They said that within this small village, 22 separate civic organizations, they had egalitarian ethos. The religious leaders were a very positive influence on the community, just lots of social capital. So that ended up being the thing that was the primary explanatory factor for this difference in life. This is not surprising if you are familiar with the literature on social capital. Social capital is kind of the secret sauce. If you want to make communities better, you just throw some social capital at it because it improves health outcomes, it improves economic performance of the community, it improves political processes, government services, lots of different things. And so we know that it's really important. And also, going back to the Rosetta case, there was a follow-up study later, and they showed that once you remove social capital from communities, it has the opposite impact. In this case, they end up with erosion of the traditional families. There were some conflicts within the village. The civic organizations fell apart. One of the religious leaders died, and it ended up leading to a collapse of the social capital, and as a result, immediately following, all of the health indicators fell off as well. So there's a lot of studies that find these same patterns in terms of trying to find different exogenous factors that would explain higher levels of social capital so that you can determine how they impact the communities. So within the nonprofit sector, one of the important roles that some of these organizations play is really as an instigator and a protector of the development of social capital within communities. And we know that social capital can then be tied to health, wealth, happiness, and things that we care about within the communities. And within a lot of these instances, if you look at the research on social capital, one of the consistent stories you find are that the communities that have high levels of social capital also have a large number of these civic associations, religious entities that tend to be some of the drivers of the social capital. Voluntary associations, friendship networks, hobby clubs, these are some of the mechanisms as well. We also know this is obviously not an exogenous factor, that social capital in communities is going to have a large impact on the types of civic organizations that are created as well. So there's this sort of cyclical story that you have to account for. And it's not clear kind of the chicken or the egg question in terms of which of these is creating the other. But for the nonprofit case, some of my research has looked at the formation of nonprofit organizations based upon a variety of different programs, partly tied to government support, philanthropic support, various other assets that are within the communities. For this paper, this is looking at a combination of research using a survey of 10,000 nonprofit startups. We sent this out to organizations that were created between 2008 and 2011. This was a project with David Van Slyke, and we were trying to understand some of the early stage processes for these nonprofits, what inspired the founders to create a nonprofit, what resources that they had to draw upon during that process, and then how successful they were at creating sustainable organizations and generating impact. And then there's also some insights that are drawn from this 30-year panel of IRS tax data. One of the great parts about nonprofit research is we are one of the only parts of the economy where you can observe a large portion of the population of organizations working within this area over a long period of time. So if you can tie this into other data sources, it's useful in terms of identifying some of the mechanisms here. So for the stocks of nonprofit organizations within the community, if you just do a cross-section looking at size of communities and the size of the nonprofit sector, you do find quite a bit of variation within a size range for organizations. So in this case, at 100,000 population, the variation is from 2 to 15 nonprofits per 10,000 people. So a seven-fold difference in terms of the quality of the civic capital within those organizations. These are only the human service organizations within these cases. But you do have quite a large range, and part of this research is trying to understand where that variation comes from. If you look at nonprofits per 10,000 people, in 2000, the average community had about 7 nonprofits per 10,000 people. That's across these 5 subsectors that we're looking at for this study. But again, you see quite a bit of variation, up to 60 people, or 60 nonprofits per 10,000 people. When you look back at the Rosetta case, the outcomes within that community, the fact that they were such large outliers, makes sense when you put them in context relative to most of the communities we're studying. They had twice as much civic capital as any of the counties within our data set here. So you can see why the nonprofit sector was able to provide this sort of level of protective support. question for this study is trying to understand, then if we know that the nonprofit density is important in having an impact on communities, how can we understand the creation of new nonprofits and then how that leads to more nonprofit density? So for this study, we were looking at the growth in nonprofit sector density from 2000 to 2010. So the outcome here is going to be the number of nonprofits per 10,000 people within the communities. And then we're looking at a variety of factors that are predictive of this. So on average, we see a growth of about 3 nonprofits per community over this time period. And the question is, what factors are predictive of the growth? So this is just some background information looking at the rise in nonprofit density. The interesting part of this research is when you look at the literature, there are lots of theories that suggest that the philanthropic activity within communities and the needs of the communities should be predicting a rise in nonprofits because they're created to address certain social problems, so they should be locating in communities with highest need. The philanthropic sector is also providing a lot of grants to support nonprofit activities, so you would think that having larger foundations in your community and more grant money would be predictive of more nonprofits. But in the net, what we find is the story is really a supply side story, that the biggest predictors of the strength of the nonprofit sector is the strength of the community before the new nonprofits are created. So these are all in effect sizes. These are new nonprofits created as a result of a standard deviation increase in these independent variables. And the significant ones here are primarily around rise in education levels, as well as household wealth. So an increase in the wealth status of the community that are predictive of more nonprofits. The direct government payments, this is a story of outsourcing of government services. So primarily it's governments that are hiring nonprofits to provide services that they used to provide or would be providing, so a contracting out story. And then the inequality is kind of a gentrification story. These are communities where you have increase in wealth and increase in inequality, so primarily those are communities where there is rising, or gentrification, which is leading to the rising inequality.
How do you measure direct government payments? Is it on the 90s you're looking at how much money they received, or
no.
is it actually from, good, okay.
No, it's from the census measures of the government payments. Yeah, it's total budgets for local government and then the number of local government employees. So decreases in those are associated with increases in nonprofits.
Oh, decreases in those?
Decreases in number of government employees. As the governments are downsizing, they're outsourcing their capacity and hiring nonprofits to do the work they would be doing. The Democrat one, I think, is interesting. I don't have a good story for that. But the ones that you should find large effects for, according to the literature, are the philanthropic capital, the generosity of the communities, charitable donations, and then things that are traditional measures of civic social capital. You know, Putnam points to churches a lot. These are church memberships, so we use I'm not going to remember the database, but it tracks a number of devotees to over a dozen different religious traditions, and they do a census. And so the demand side factors around kind of the types of problems that you would expect nonprofits to be addressing, you would think that that would crowd in more nonprofits to those communities because they're locating where they're most needed, right? But we don't see effects for those controls. And then the population is a little bit weird, but we think that that's a lag factor. Large, fast-growing metropolitan areas just need some time for the nonprofit sector to catch up. But, interesting, maybe not surprising, maybe a little surprising depending upon what literature you're reading, but primarily it's through those supply side factors. So the assets that a community holds supports the creation of new nonprofits more than the demand for the types of services that the nonprofits are able to provide.
Are you able at all to take into consideration the size of the nonprofits when you're doing this, or is it just a straight count?
This is count, but if you control for the budgets, it's the same findings.
Okay. I'm just wondering if there's one dominating.
Yeah, capacity is really hard, but yeah, when we've run it both ways and it doesn't change it. So then, those are the broad trends. It's a 10-year period. You're using county level measures. In this instance, we get to drill down a little bit more into some of the characteristics. So this was a survey that was sent out, and this asked a lot of questions about the formation process. For this, the major findings, the things that really stuck with me from the survey, was that the people starting nonprofits they are unique in a variety of ways. The population as a whole has about a 35% rate of college education. Nonprofit founders have a 92%, about 92% have college degrees. Most of these people had higher level degrees, graduate degrees, professional degrees, doctors, lawyers, engineers, and the like. Income was much higher than the population in general. More white than the population in general, and then on average about 33% of entrepreneurs for small businesses are female, and about 55% of our sample of entrepreneurs, nonprofit entrepreneurs are female. So more representative in terms of gender, but also just very wealthy, educated, and white was the takeaway from the attributes of the people starting nonprofits. So the combination of these two studies, it's caused me some angst and raised a lot of questions about if it's the case that the communities that are already the best off and the most stable and have the most assets are the ones where the nonprofit sector is growing the fastest. And the people starting the nonprofits are privileged in a variety of ways. What are the implications for the types of organizations that are created and the ways that they're going to approach social problems? So you can tie this to representative bureaucracy, a lot of different theories about how you might approach various endeavors. These studies got me thinking a lot about this and trying to understand how are the nonprofits actually approaching the types of problems that they encounter in their communities, and what implications does that have for the communities. The other important dimension, though, that's really hard to capture with the density research is we're looking at numbers of organizations within communities. The organizations are binned by these broad categories of NTE codes. If you're familiar with these, it's 26 different codes to describe the types of nonprofits: arts, education, environment, human services, lots of different characteristics. And right now, with the density stuff, we're counting numbers within each of these bins and looking at patterns in terms of which we're growing. But the other aspect that was bothersome was, is the number of organizations really the thing that you would care about in terms of its impact on the communities? So are there other ways that you can get at the qualitative aspects of what they are doing? What about their missions? How do you measure their missions? So the way that we, and partly this is tied back to this finding that kind of, I wasn't sure how to explain that. I think there are lots of interesting stories that could be told there. I'd be interested if anybody has ideas about that. But the idea that you might have different approaches to the problems that you encounter, and those approaches are going to be based upon your own experiences and your own worldviews and your own values, and that might shape the types of activities that the nonprofits are doing within the communities.
How is that vote Democrat variable coded? Is it like a dummy variable?
It's a percentage of people who voted for presidential candidates in 2000 and 2008. So the change in the percentage as the independent voters. So one way that we thought we could come at this, the hard part is trying to observe the values of a community, the attributes of the people who are working in nonprofits and how that might shape the way that they approach problems. And so, this is a pretty rough instrument, but we know that political parties have different values and different worldviews. They would prescribe different sorts of policies for the same problems. So this was at least a way to kind of test this theory if there were some qualitative dimensions that were worth pursuing. What we did is we gathered voting district data from Texas. So districts are fairly small, much smaller than the county level data that we're using for the previous studies. And we were able to get all of the county data, or the voting district data for all of Texas. And then we were looking at supermajority districts only. So these are more than 70% in one direction or the other. More than 70% of the voters voting for one of the candidates. And when we did this is Houston, and this is what the supermajority districts look like. The red are the Republican, blue are Democrat. And then the white are the balanced districts where you don't have a supermajority. But when you do this, the problem is when you compare the demographic characteristics across these communities, not surprisingly, you have different demographics. So the Republican communities tend to be more white, lower poverty, lower density. And this was the close to 700 supermajority districts in the state of Texas. So what we had to do was a propensity score matching process. You got to find your twins within the data sets. From the close to 700, we ended up with 102 that we were able to match to find statistically equivalent communities. And then we used these as the districts for the identification of nonprofits. And we were able to find 125 nonprofits that were located within these 102 supermajority voting districts. And then we went to all their websites, collected all the mission statements. So we're getting past the NTE codes. And then we developed a couple of schema, and we coded the mission statements according to these schema in order to assess some of the qualitative differences. So the first schema was related to the type of organization. Putnam-style nonprofits are the social capital, the bowling leagues, religious entities, sports clubs, civic associations that Putnam uses broadly in his work. The O group or the Olson group, so these are collective action entities. There are things like labor unions, professional associations, any organization that would have a membership that they're advocating for. And then the S group is a group that we borrowed these groups from some existing research, and then we developed the S group as a Solomon type group, which is just a social service group because that was broadly missing from these other types, and it is an important part of the nonprofit sector. And so we coded these, and we didn't really find many differences there, which we were kind of surprised about, but we did find a modest difference in terms of the religiosity of the missions. It was if religion was explicitly mentioned in the mission statement, it was coded as religious or not. And then the targeting disadvantaged populations. Here's where there's least effect, and the nonprofits located in Democratic supermajority districts were Democratic supermajority districts that were equivalent. So these were all similar densities, so it's not suburban compared to urban neighborhoods. These are both kind of quasi-urban, quasi-suburban neighborhoods with the same proportions of white population, same proportions of poverty. Within those communities, the Democratic nonprofits, or nonprofits located in Democratic supermajority districts, were twice as likely to target disadvantaged populations. So these were the main findings, and it, did provide enough fodder that this is an interesting facet of the nonprofit sector that is really hard to measure because it is this qualitative part where you have to code some mission data. But it did kind of pique our curiosity in terms of how can we further unravel the story of the idea that the nonprofits are locating in the stable, healthy communities, not in the vulnerable communities that we'd expect, and that there are these interesting facets to the missions. So we're looking for ways to kind of further this research agenda and figure out how can we systematically study this to understand, are there important ways that nonprofits are systematically targeting certain communities and benefiting certain populations.
Sorry to interrupt. I just can't stop thinking about something, so I decided I need to just ask you. So the original regression you showed us where there were results for Democrats creating more nonprofits. Do you think that's just a density issue? Do you think that if you control for changes in density here that the partisanship thing would go away?
We did have density in one of the models, and I don't remember what, I'd have to go back and look at it, but
I was just curious and it was bothering me and I wasn't listening to you, so I figured.
yeah. No, it's a good question. I could go back on. This wasn't all the variables in the model.
Okay.
There were some other controls, so I can check on that.
Thank
but
you.
we did use the county fixed effect, but the density would be
But
changing.
the growth, yeah, so.
Yeah, but it was at the county level, so I guess it would just have to be.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
All right, so I'm going to present real quick kind of a research trajectory that's based upon this initial work looking at the creation of new nonprofits, where they're created, what sorts of communities they're working with, and then who is contributing to their formation, and then how that might affect kind of this this process of nonprofits either alleviating or contributing to inequality in some ways. This work is partly based upon this collaboration that was created primarily in response to the release of the 990 e-filing data. There are some really great data sources for nonprofits that have been underappreciated and just not available for a long time. The e-filing data took the 990 form, which the 30-year panel we have on nonprofits is primarily based upon about 200 financial fields that the IRS has hand-coded for all of the 400,000 nonprofit filers each year and then released publicly. The 990 fields themselves have over 2,000 variables that cover all aspects of governance, board membership, program missions, program service accomplishments, a variety of things that are super interesting from the management perspective and from the program's perspective. And we've just not had that data because it was not digitized. The e-filing process has made all of it available. It just is in really stupid formats and the forms are super messy. So this collective was created as a way to try to coordinate and collaborate on making sense of this data and then getting it into some format where it's clean and reasonable and documented so that it can be more broadly available. This project is kind of an offshoot of this, and it's using a different data set, the 1023 EZs, which are the form you file with the IRS when you apply for your tax-exempt status. So it's an interesting form because it's the form where you're making your case why you deserve to be a tax-exempt entity. So you have to describe what you intend to do as an organization, and you fill out a bunch of different variables declaring typically for the nonprofits that are below 50,000 a year anticipated annual revenue, because a lot of them haven't started operating yet, and at the time of formation they have less than $250,000 in assets. So these are kind of the grassroots representative organizations that are coming from the communities. These are not some of the larger corporate nonprofits being created for a variety of purposes. We have 200,000 applicants, but more importantly, the application includes the name and address of board members, as well as the address of the nonprofits. And so what this has allowed us to do is to create this geocoded database where we have information on the locations of all of the board members, as well as the nonprofits, as well as the activities they're doing, and some other attributes. We were able to link up to a Social Security Administration API to pull genders of all the board members, so we can do some analysis on the gender dimensions as well. But the cool part about this is we've always had the nonprofit locations, so we can look at the density stuff, but we now have the other side of the coin, which is where the board members are located. And this allows us to do some interesting things in terms of, these are maps of Pittsburgh here, and this is a similar map. It's just the map is removed, and we're looking at the grid here in terms of distances. Red dots represent board members, the gray dots represent the nonprofits. And using these, you can look at the things like the average distance of board members to the nonprofit. So you can get some sense of how local the organizations are, if they are recruiting primarily from the hyper-local neighborhoods, or if they are recruiting more broadly. What you find with this is that the majority of board members come from less than a mile away from the nonprofits. There's a long tail there, so lots of exceptions, but a lot of the nonprofits, they're primarily recruiting from the broader kind of neighborhoods that they're part of. Another great attribute of this is that we can match you can spatially join the address to the census tract and then use that data in order to understand the characteristics of the community that the nonprofit is located in, as well as the characteristics of the communities that the board members come from. And so we're not observing the board members' income or race or attributes directly, but statistically, if you have 800,000 of them, as long as you're using the neighborhoods they come from, then they're pretty good statistical profiles of what the board members look like. And what this allows us to do is to look at some of the alignment of the communities that the nonprofits are located in versus the characteristics of the communities that the boards are coming from. So how are the nonprofits leveraging assets? You would think that the theory would suggest the nonprofits are crowding in resources from board members and donations and grants from foundations. One of the reasons that they're suggested to be more effective than government is because they can draw resources from a variety of sources. They create social capital through kind of their activities on the boards, and as a result, the community should be stronger as a result of the bridging process that the boards create for the communities, right? We might expect to see some differences in terms of types of nonprofits. There's, in the social capital theory, there's a difference between bonding social capital, which are close-knit groups, very dense networks, and the ties are reinforcing in terms of values or norms, identities. And then there's bridging social capital, which are institutions that have members from different contexts, and within those institutions, you have interesting exchange of ideas and resources, those sorts of things. So for the process of understanding how the nonprofits, these startup nonprofits are leveraging these sorts of social capital resources.
Just ask a quick question. With respect to the office location or where the nonprofit is located, that means where the office itself is located. It may not necessarily be where they do their work.
Yes, and I mean, that's a good question, and it will vary by subsector, but by and large, when we check this, it's a good approximation. And then Scott Allard has some good work looking at service catchments, and for social services especially, most of the clients of a lot of nonprofits are located within 2 miles of the point of service delivery. So these are some assumptions, but there's some good support for why they're reasonable assumptions. But yes, these are nonprofit addresses of where they're located. So the theory that we're drawing upon for the social capital formation comes from Brian Uzi, who's one of my favorite scholars, and he has this great paper looking at how social capital contributes to effective teams. And this, I think it's a really great case of finding a way to answer a hard question by being clever about the data. And what he's looking at here are, he coded 100 years of Broadway musicals and their success. And it turns out that for most of the musicals, they have these teams of approximately 5 people that are doing the set design, costume design, script, music, score, choreography, etc. And so those teams, what you find across these different musicals is that, in this case, these 2 shared 1 member. In this case, these 2 shared 2 members. And so you had varying amounts of overlap between these teams working on the musicals. And using this, you can create these network structures looking at how much social capital these varying periods in Broadway history have had in terms of the density of connections between creatives. And so what he finds, the main takeaway from this is that there's this Goldilocks principle where if you have too much social capital, too much network connectedness within these artistic communities, then it leads to stagnant ideas. If it's just the same team working on a bunch of projects together, there's no infusion, no tension, and it leads to poor outcomes. And he measures it in terms of the financial success of each musical as well as the artistic acclaim. So they've coded all of the reviews in the New York Times. And then if you have too loose capital, so none of the 5 members have worked together before, you end up with not good outcomes as well. But there's a sweet spot where if they have a couple of team members who've worked on previous projects that are working on a new project, but also new members, then you tend to be most effective. And they've taken this work and they've generalized it and looked at similar processes across a bunch of different industries, including academics, and they found similar dynamics in terms of this sweet spot in that sort of social capital. And so they talk about this in terms of team assembly mechanisms. We can't directly observe that process, but with the nonprofit survey research we did of the startups and the nonprofit entrepreneurs, we did some interviews as well, and we had a lot of qualitative data from that study. And some of the most interesting kind of qualitative components were how the founders were describing where the ideas came from and then the early stage processes. And if you know anything about startups, the early phases are always chaotic. It's, you're trying to get things off the ground, you've got an idea, you're looking for people to support it. And one of the findings from the startup process, we assume that the boards typically for nonprofits, like 90% of board members are donating financially, a lot of them significantly, to support the nonprofits. And they also, part of their role is to lend their networks for fundraising campaigns in a variety of ways. And so we expected within these nonprofits for the board to serve a similar sort of patronage process. It turned out, though, that the majority of the startup boards were not contributing financially to the startup nonprofits, and that the main role that they served, these are startups, no one's heard of them before, they're brand new, so there's basically no prestige associated with being on a startup nonprofit board, because it's not a brand that anyone would recognize. The main role that these board members served is they were recruited because of their commitment to the mission. That was the primary thing that they said interested them about being part of the project, is they thought that the idea was important. And then they primarily contributed in terms of time and expertise, and oftentimes like actively putting on early stage projects, being part of the process versus other sorts. The governance roles are pretty minimal at that point because there's not a lot to govern. So that recruitment process was primarily mediated through the social networks of the founder, and then the geography of the social capital around the founder. So you saw that most nonprofit board members are coming from within a mile of the nonprofits, the startup nonprofits. So there's that geography of social capital that would shape this formation process. And then once the board is formed, the way that they approach the social problems is going to be largely a function of the characteristics of the board members. In the early stages, most of the nonprofits did not have kind of stable programs developed, and they spent a lot of time just iterating through different models, throwing things at the wall to see what sticks. And so that team was a big part of that process. And so the development of the theory of change, how they conceptualized social problems, and as a result, how they would design programs for that, and then the testing process resulting in program mix. That is going to stem from the board and that founding team that's created to solve those problems, and that's going to be mediated largely by the founder's social capital. And then ultimately the things, we know that that's going to have an impact on the community. We don't have data on this right now, but that's something that we're hoping to tie to. So this was one of the most striking features of the models that we're running right now. The biggest predictor, kind of not surprisingly, if you think about how the boards are created through the social capital of the founder, there was a strong and highly significant correlation between the wealth of the community in which the nonprofit was located and then the wealth of the board members. So instead of kind of distributing resources across the nonprofit sector, you end up having this crowding in process where the highest degrees of wealth are concentrated in the nonprofits located in the most well-off communities. So it's the reinforcing mechanism, not a redistributive mechanism. And then the other aspect of this is after that process was formed, we can look at the distributions of types of nonprofits in different geographies of the city, and it's kind of interesting, but it's hard to interpret. Is this good or is it bad? What's the right sort of geographic distribution? So what we've done is to break these out and tie the nonprofit to the characteristics of the communities that they're located in, and then looking at, one way to conceptualize this is the types of solutions that were evolving from the theories of change that the boards were bringing to the problems. But what you see here is these are the income ranges of the communities, the host communities. So green are the lower income communities, gray is middle income, and then the purple is high income. If you look across the types of nonprofits, within the poor communities, you tend to have a high percentage of these service organizations: housing, crime, employment, youth safety. Within the middle income communities, you have a higher concentration or kind of even concentration of mental health, public benefit, animals, arts, education, sports, environment, health. So these are kind of the Putnam style amenities within the communities. And then in the high income communities, you have an overrepresentation of the meds and eds, the social science, philanthropy, disease, which is primarily research, and so some of the scientific and cultural institutions. And so this is another kind of view of that same data with the community wealth as the factor on the bottom here, and then a density version here. So you get a little bit more separation, and you can kind of see the differences in terms of the types. This is the average of all of these types of nonprofits and kind of where it's located on the map, and you see the separation of the types of services that the communities will have access to, or the mix of services. And so you do see that the nonprofit sector is not distributed evenly across the geography, not surprisingly. But then you do have this sorting process where low-income communities have a lot of these services that, by and large, serve as substitutes for government. They're nonprofits that are contracted by governments to provide the services within these neighborhoods. They're no longer being provided in some of the instances. The quality of life nonprofits, they're supporting the types of Putnam activities that lead to more social capital. But also they tend to target human capital accumulation. And then the larger nonprofits in the wealthier communities, these are basically creative class employers, large hospitals, large universities, research entities, these sorts of things that would tend to benefit high-income individuals. This is mostly descriptive, looking at the differences across these. I'll just mention one more way that we're kind of slicing this data. This is looking at that qualitative aspect that's a little bit harder to capture. And this is trying to understand better the impact of the team that is created from the founder in order to create those theories of change and define the programs. What we're able to do, this is the data from just the arts nonprofits. And so we're taking the only arts organizations that are located in the low-income communities, and then we are separating out those where the average income of board members is low. Primarily, you see this matching process where community type and board type tend to be very similar. But we can compare then those to the organizations where they're located in poor communities, but their board members are primarily wealthy. The assumption being that they might approach problems differently just based upon backgrounds and experiences. And we are using something called semantic network analysis. So we can take the program missions that we have through the data and break them into these abstract representations where the networks represent concepts that are within the same mission statements, and then aggregated over thousands of these, you end up with these really dense networks. But you can break these apart and look at the occurrence of varying dyads. They're called statements. It's two words that occur together, so economic development. Is that significant within an instance where you have 100,000 of these dyadic relationships within this network? We've got a sampling process together where you can essentially come up with a statistical way to identify within that pooled population, if you randomly would draw these networks you would expect to see a certain number of relationships between some of the words. And then you can identify essentially these ties which are statistically significant, and then isolate the ones that are only present within the missions that were written by the nonprofits that have board members coming from predominantly wealthy neighborhoods and that are working in poor communities, compared to where the board members are coming from the poor communities themselves. So you can start to get these contrasts to parse out a little bit at least a sense of the different ways that the wealthier board members would approach the problem solving than the kind of the more representative bonding social capital sorts of boards. So I can talk more about how we're extending this. We're sponsoring a machine learning contest and building some text databases to do this, but that is most kind of the basic arc of trying to build from past research and then using some of the newly available data, trying to figure out ways where we can augment it by batching it with political data and census data, and then using the text in order to parse out some of these relationships and get more of a sense of what's driving these services that we see within the communities, and whether or not we think that the nonprofit sector, because it's a market-based approach to social problems, these are all voluntarily created private entities that are funded in a variety of ways. Do we think that this is going to actually address the social problems that are most urgent, especially that inequality piece? If by and large the wealthier communities are better able to crowd in resources, establish more nonprofits, attract wealthier board members, that has to have an impact on the quality of services within those entities. So, questions?
I'm thinking about Colvin's work on social capital, and in the kinds of examples that he gives of social capital, you obviously have these nonprofits or formal organizations, but a lot of his examples really talk about the informal organization. And I'm wondering to what extent there are informal social capital organizations that really complement the bureaucratic. And so if it really is a question of wealth, and lower income people cannot really start a nonprofit, maybe there's these informal organizations that complement what these bureaucracies do. And I'm just wondering if did you encounter in your fields any of these other kinds of organizations?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole literature on the grassroots entities and the informal entities. Yeah. And I mean, part of the reason I thought this was a good data set is because they're nonprofits that are, revenues less than 50,000, so they primarily are, they don't have employees, they're supported primarily by the communities, these sorts of things. So it gets at some of that, but not all of it. And so there would be some, I mean, definitely, it would be interesting if you have any ideas about how to measure whether this is a good proxy for the level of social capital within the communities. That would be interesting, and I don't know how to get at that. The other side of that is all of the digital activism stuff. It's much easier to organize into groups now without any formal version of it, and so you probably have a lot of things happening there as well.
You mentioned, I really liked your presentation, by the way, I'm quite impressed. You mentioned Robert Putnam, and Robert Putnam in his book on Italy argues that it's more soccer than churches, right, that count for social capital. And he continues with that theme in Bowling Alone, where he argues that citizen engagement through, for instance, non-profits is declining in the United States. As a counterpart, a colleague of his, Peter Scotchbold, had in a series of publications, the one that comes to mind is in 2003, a book, where she argues no, civic engagement is actually not declining at all, but it all depends on what you're looking at. So she argues in the 19th century there were charter organizations as non-profits that had a whole variety of different objectives within one body, whereas now we're much more single-purpose non-profits. So my question for you is, when you look at your data, when I look at this, I think, wow, that looks pretty good actually, the non-profit activity. So I would be inclined to leave Scotch goes sooner than Putnam, but I suppose it depends upon perspective. What would you say?
1 second. So this is rates of exit and rates of entry in the nonprofit sector over time. These are the vital statistics, and then the density is the stock. New nonprofits and dying nonprofits are the flows, right? So this is the flow view, and what you find is that exit rates have been incrementally increasing, and entry rates have been decreasing. And so by 2010, the growth rate, which is just entry minus exit, this is a distribution across all of the 300 largest metro areas. And so that's the variance across the different metro areas. In some areas it's negative, in some slightly positive, but it's centered right on 0 by 2010, which is 10 years ago, right? And this is consistent with the predictions from the Organization of Ecology literature on what happens to an industry as it naturally ages. So you'd end up here. This is the interesting part. There are two ways it could go. There's one story about a shakeout, where exit rates exceed entry, and then you'd have agglomeration. So the 200 automobile industries, and resulting in 5 major automobile industries, manufacturers, as a result of that shakeout process. And then the other story is just a steady state where you have a certain number of nonprofits. So restaurants within cities is a good example of that, where every year there's a bunch of new restaurants and a bunch that are closing, but in the net, you have about the same amount every year. So I'm guessing nonprofits are more like restaurants than automobile manufacturers, just because of lack of economies of scale for most of the subsectors.
There has been some Brookings work done on for-profit startups, and they graphed exit and entry, and it looks amazingly like that. Those two lines cross at almost the same time.
Around 2010.
Around 2010, I think it was 2006, 2007.
There's an overall decline in rates of entrepreneurship in the U.S.
Yes, it's been going back since the 70s.
Yeah, and so that's I'm not sure how that relates to that, but that's...
Yeah, but it just, just a knee-jerk reaction.
Yeah.
Do you have any information about, like, whether these startups are, do they correspond to, like, the tech startup boom that's, like, you know what I'm saying, like the Silicon Valley? Like, are any nonprofits tech startups?
Probably have a small number. It's definitely the power law. Some new nonprofits, it could be we had varying explanations within the data set. The primary one was just like entrepreneurial activities of the founder. They had an idea or they saw a problem and they reacted to it. But there was a small number were spin-offs. A program that started an existing nonprofit or existing for-profit, and it outgrew its early phase. It became too big and it was creating mission creep, so it was spun off as its own entity. There are some that were kind of nurtured through other entities, that sort of thing. But like ProPublica would probably be an example where it was some journalists who were given a good chunk of change, like $10 million to start an investigative journalism nonprofit. And those, they, out of nowhere, they go from a budget of 0 to lots. But those are the exceptions, not the rule.
Just earlier you had a slide where you characterized nonprofits, and I think it was your lower income bracket, as substitutes for government. And first a question and a thought in light of your discussion with David here about other ways you could measure social capital. So clarify, characterize these substitutes for government, that was the one that you had there, as contractors for government, or literal substitutes where governments are no longer providing a particular service and a nonprofit has emerged to move in?
In the nonprofit literature, you end up with a few theories about, the roles they play and